Hey y'all, it's Jennifer. Welcome back to my channel. Today I am coming to you with some Wars of the Roses historical fiction. This has been a highly requested video of mine. Most of you probably know though that the Wars of the Roses is one of my favorite time periods, and specifically that Richard III is my favorite historical figure. And if you were completely unfamiliar with what the Wars of the Roses were, they were essentially an English civil war that happened during the 1400s for decades and decades. Just when you think it's over, it never is in terms of the Wars of the Roses. And there are two main sides to the Wars of the Roses, the Lancastrians that kind of eventually morph into the Tudors with Henry VII's victory at the Battle of Bosworth. He is essentially the first Tudor king, but he is also on the Lancastrian side of things through his mother. And on the other side are the Yorkists. And so this is Edward IV, Richard III. I am pretty staunchly Yorkist, as you might can imagine, given that I'm a big Richard III fan, but plenty of these books do skew a little bit, just a little bit. They skew a little bit Lancastrian because in historical fiction, I'm very forgiving with portrayals of Richard III. In nonfiction, not so much. I think there is a tendency to either go one extreme or the other with Richard III, and a lot of these historical fiction books do that. And I don't necessarily have the problem with it in historical fiction that I do in nonfiction. So I thought I would talk about all of the ones that I have read and all of the ones that I have physically and tell you what I think about them and whether or not I recommend them. There are a lot of people who are really interested in getting into this time period and are a little bit confused by it because there are so many people with the same name in it, and there are also so many different things happening, so many different battles, so many overlapping kind of bloodlines and family ties, because this is a little bit at its heart, this is a war between two branches of the same family. When you go back far enough, these people were cousins. And how I initially got into the Wars of the Roses was through historical fiction. And I actually think historical fiction is the best way to get into a new time period. And I know that that kind of goes against everything that historians might tell you, that you should read a nonfiction. But I think historical fiction can be the best way to do it because you can then get a feel for certain historical figures, and you can get a feel for the time period by seeing it through a fictional lens, which I think will then make you more comfortable with nonfiction. So this is actually the way that I recommend getting into the Wars of the Roses. Now, for many people, there is one historical fiction series above all others that really got them into this time period, that got them thinking about it, and you probably know what it is. It is the Cousins War series by Philippa Gregory, starting with the White Queen. Now, the first three books in this series, The White Queen, The Red Queen, and The Kingmaker's Daughter, were all developed into the miniseries The White Queen, which aired here on Starz and I think BBC in the UK. And I really, really love that miniseries. And I think when you're starting into the Wars of the Roses, I think you could do worse than watching it. There's a lot that is technically wrong with both the miniseries and the book series by Philippa Gregory. She does cut corners quite a bit, but the interesting thing is that this series is told from the women's point of view, which is still actually a relatively rare thing. And I actually really appreciate it for that. And I'm willing to forgive her where she cuts corners, where she twists events, where she kind of puts battles out of order. As a matter of fact, in a couple of the books, the battles are out of order. But again, I am very forgiving with historical fiction. I am somebody who recognizes historical fiction is in no way responsible for teaching someone what actually happened in the period. And so I really have no problems with the things that she changed. There is a later book in the series, which is The White Princess, that I think is truly horrific in terms of historical accuracy and in terms of how it treats the historical figures that are in that book. And that's the one that is the most egregious to me, and that's the one where I can definitely see people's complaints about it. But Philippa Gregory is kind of known for that, for putting her own personal bias in her books at this point. I think you know what you're getting with a Philippa Gregory book at this point. And so definitely you are getting her perspective on things and her absolute opinion on everything that happened. I would say the Cousins War series in general is more Yorkist based than Lancastrian. She does have a couple of books focusing on people on the Lancastrian side of things, but always the more favorable portrait is given to those on the Yorkist side, including Richard III. I really, really love her Richard III, and I have no shame in it. I really think that she really developed an interesting figure in Richard III in her fictional series. I think it was really, really done well in that he is actually not a saint, though he is innocent of some of the crimes that he's accused of. He's also shown doing a lot of really questionable things, which is the Richard III portrayal that I am most interested in, is somebody who toes the line in the middle. A lot of people hate Philippa Gregory. A lot of people are not interested in reading her at all. I completely understand why. But in my opinion, when you are starting out with this period, you really could do worse. She does make everything so extremely digestible, and because it is from the women's perspective, you don't spend a lot of time on the battlefield, which I think is where people get lost when it comes into the Wars of the Roses, because there are a lot of battles that take place pretty rapidly. There are battles that take place at the same location, so you have a first and second battle of St. Albans, for example. I think it's helpful to get a fairly linear structure early on. I think that's really helpful. And I will say Philippa Gregory was one of my first forays into the Wars of the Roses after reading Shakespeare. And so I really do have a soft spot for this series. I don't think it is the most technically proficient, and I also don't think it is the most historically accurate, but then it's not trying to be, and none of these are. None of the books on this list are trying to be 100% historically accurate. There is another relatively big historical fiction series that focuses on the Wars of the Roses, and that is the series by Conn Iggulden. Now, I don't really care for this series. I really don't like how he incorporates original characters, which is something that is very popular in Wars of the Roses historical fiction. You will find that often authors will insert kind of a POV character or somebody who is a bit of an OC, an original character, or a cast of original characters who will interact with the historical figures. And I guess they do this in a way so that you don't automatically know what the outcome of the book will be. You can't just look up their names and see whether or not they live or die. I think Conn Iggulden's original characters are incredibly clunky, and I really, really don't like them early on in the series, but then I'm not really a big fan of the early Wars of the Roses. But I will also say for this series that it does cover the early Wars of the Roses. Typically, when you are picking up a historical fiction book that is set during this time period, Edward IV is already on the throne. Though a lot of really interesting things happened prior to Edward coming onto the throne, I will say I think Conn Iggulden skews a little bit more Lancastrian. So if that's something that you're interested in, I think his portrayal of Margaret of Anjou in particular is really spectacular. I will give him that. I do think his Margaret of Anjou is incredible. And Margaret of Anjou is actually my favorite figure on the Lancastrian side, so I'm always happy to see a really good portrayal of her, or a portrayal of her at all, where she's not just mentioned, but she's actually a character in the narrative, and that happens in this series. I'm a bit of an odd man out here because this one is apparently pretty favored with a lot of fans of Wars of the Roses historical fiction and nonfiction. A lot of people really, really like this series. I think it's brutal and dirty and graphic in a way that it doesn't need to be, because I actually really like the kind of idealized portrait of the Wars of the Roses that happens in a lot of, let's say, 80s and 90s historical fiction, where it feels like chivalry isn't dead, men are all knights, even the bad guys have kind of a really noble side to them. This is a very realistic portrayal of what war during the medieval period would have been like. And I don't necessarily like that. I actually like kind of the sweet-smelling, favorable Wars of the Roses, which is actually not at all what it was. This is probably a more historically accurate telling of events than Philippa Gregory's, but I think it loses some of the magic. I think you are attracted to this time period in particular because of the historical figures, which are all larger than life. There's not just one or two greats during the Wars of the Roses. They are all really fascinating people in their own right, and they all deserve a 900-page biography about them. I think Conn Iggulden loses sight of what makes figures like that interesting. And so this is not my favorite series of the Wars of the Roses, but again, like I said, I believe I am a bit of the odd man out here, and so you very well may really like this one. This is only 4 books, while Philippa Gregory's is 6, I believe. I do, though, like that Philippa Gregory's series kind of goes a bit later than the typical end of the Wars of the Roses, and she does cover some lesser known figures. Whether or not she does that accurately is, you know, really up for debate. She definitely doesn't. She's not interested in historical accuracy. Conn Iggulden is, but sometimes when I'm reading historical fiction, I'm not really in it for the realism, if that makes sense. An author that I really would like to talk about is Susan Higginbotham. So this is The Queen of Last Hopes, and this is her book about Margaret of Anjou. She also has a book about the Duke of Buckingham, who eventually kind of created the Buckingham Rebellion early in Richard III's reign. Buckingham is actually a really popular suspect for the princes in the Tower, for who might have murdered the princes in the Tower. And Susan Higginbotham is also a historian, and so she does stray into historical fiction now and again. And I really like both of these books. I do think she skews a little bit more Lancastrian, but like I said, it doesn't need to be a perfect portrayal of Richard III for me to enjoy it, because I actually think in her book about Buckingham, there's a lot of nuance to who Richard is, but this title really shines a light on Margaret of Anjou, who, like I said, is actually my favorite figure from the Lancastrian side of things. She was the Queen of England. She was married to Henry VI, and she is actually from an area in France that was called Anjou at the time. And she was really criticized for being French, and she was also really criticized because when Henry VI kind of had his fits of madness, so they say, he became catatonic for a time and was really unresponsive for at least a year. During that time period, Margaret of Anjou essentially stepped into his role as leader of the country, and she did an incredibly good job. But she was really criticized at the time for it because she was a woman trying to insert herself in a man's role. I have a lot of respect for Margaret of Anjou, and it's actually really terrible kind of what happens to her after the downfall of the Lancastrian side earlier in the Wars of the Roses. She has a very tragic story, and in fact, the majority of her life is actually fairly tragic. And I think she's just a really interesting figure, and I really enjoyed reading a book that was all about her. And Susan Higginbotham does foreshadowing incredibly well. I will also say that I think Philippa Gregory does foreshadowing incredibly well, because when you write historical fiction about the Wars of the Roses, you're always writing it with the knowledge of what comes next. You know that Bosworth is going to happen, that Richard III will fall, that Henry VII will become the Tudor king. And so you often know in these books that are written about kind of earlier in the Wars of the Roses that they want to set up what will happen later, that even though Margaret of Anjou may have been defeated, there is a point in the future where the Lancastrian side will become more powerful. And so there's also a lot of foreshadowing about Richard as a person, about George, Duke of Clarence, Edward IV. And I think she does that really well. I also think Philippa Gregory does that fairly well, because I really think foreshadowing can be incredibly clunky in historical fiction books. And yet it's not here. This is kind of foreshadowing that raises the hairs on your arms a little bit. There's always a little bit of poetry to it in both Susan Higginbotham and in Philippa Gregory, and I think that's a skill that I'm really always looking for in Wars of the Roses historical fiction, because again, I really think there's something magical about this time period, and I think that certain authors tap into it more than others, and I really enjoy Susan Higginbotham's books. Hers are not my favorite, but I do think she's a really interesting one if you were more interested in maybe the Lancastrian side of things. Next, we will move into a section that I'm going to call Richard III romances, because this is really my bread and butter, and I'm not sorry about it. I love a Richard III romance, just absolutely love it. So the first of these is The Virgin Widow by Anne O'Brien. Now, Anne O'Brien is a really famous historical fiction writer, and she's written a lot of books in the kind of late medieval period, and I've really enjoyed the majority of what I've read from her. This is her first book, and it feels like it. So this book focuses on Anne Neville, who is Richard III's eventual wife. And it does it a disparity to call it a Richard III romance, because this is in fact really about Anne as a character, and I really enjoy it. Anne Neville is the daughter of the kingmaker, who essentially made Edward IV the King of England, who was Richard III's brother. See, all of this stuff is very intertwined. But Anne Neville kind of is the heir to a bit of a fortune, and so she does marry Richard III. Her sister marries George, Duke of Clarence, Richard III's brother. And the interesting thing is, there's very little about Anne Neville in the historical record. So essentially, when you want to write about Anne Neville, you have to write historical fiction. There's very little about her personality that's known for sure, for example, and that kind of does go more broadly for this period in general, and it's very hard to pin down women in particular. But Anne Neville is a really shadowy figure from this time period, unfortunately. I really like Virgin Widow's portrayal of her because Anne Neville is often always portrayed as a bit of a kind of soft, meek, really somebody who's being pushed along by everyone around her, someone who is not independent, who is not making her own decisions. But I do think that there is a level of nuance to Anne Neville in this book. She lived an incredibly interesting life, a lot of it tragic as well. That's kind of the key with the Wars of the Roses. There was a lot of tragedy. But I really enjoyed this, and I do typically enjoy Anne O'Brien. So this is one that I recommend, and I would say this skews more Yorkist. Next, let's move on to one of my favorite authors of Wars of the Roses historical fiction, and that's Sandra Worth. So this is The Rose of York, Love and War, and this is a love story between Richard III and Anne Neville. And I have a real soft spot for this series. This is actually a 3-book series. It's a trilogy, I guess. And I have a real soft spot for it. I have a real soft spot for how she portrays Richard, for how she portrays Anne. I don't think this one will work well for everyone because this is a bit of an older historical fiction, and you might can tell from the artwork on the front that she does go for that kind of chivalric tradition. This is heavily endorsed by the Richard III Society, so you might can imagine the portrayal of Richard is very, very favorable. Now that is really annoying for some people. Some people really hate the kind of saintly portrayal of Richard III that is very popular in some historical fiction books. I can get tired of it as well, but I also really like it. That's my guilty pleasure. My guilty pleasure is a sweet Richard III, and I'm not ashamed of it. I really, really love it. This series is my bread and butter, and I really like Sandra Worth's writing. She also has another book that I haven't read yet that is about a later period in the Wars of the Roses about Perkin Warbeck, who was a pretender to the English throne, and so I'm really interested to read that one day. But this one is one that I just have a soft spot for. My favorite Richard III romance is actually A Rose for the Crown by Anne Easter Smith. Anne Easter Smith is probably my favorite Wars of the Roses historical fiction writer. She also wrote a series focusing on Cecily Neville, who was mother to Edward IV, George, Duke of Clarence, and Richard III. And that's also really good, but this one is so good. It's so sweeping. This does have an original character in it. This actually focuses on the woman that Anne Easter Smith posits was the mother of Richard III's illegitimate children. And now Richard did have a couple of illegitimate children. It's never been known who their mother was or if they even had the same mother, but he did have these illegitimate children prior to his marriage with Anne Neville. What this book does so well is that it makes you so invested in Kate as a person. Kate is the original character. You are so invested in who Kate is that you care very little about what's going on in the actual war. You also care very little about Richard in that you wouldn't mind if the book was just entirely about Kate living a normal life. This is a case where the original characters were really well folded in my opinion, and I just love this book. I just really, really love this book. This is potentially my second favorite. I still have a number one that we will get to. I will save it for last, but this one is really sweeping. And if you kind of like a romance in your historical fiction, this is a really good one. And it's one that you don't really know where it's going to go because Kate is an original character. You do in some ways know where it's going because you know historically what happens and you know historically Richard gets married. So it's a very interesting book. It's absolutely huge and it will take you some time to get through, but it's just an absolutely sweeping historical fiction. It's one of my favorites. Anne Easter Smith's books are also heavily endorsed by the Richard III Society, similar to Sandra Worth. So as you might can imagine, this also skews very Yorkist. and it also gives a pretty whitewashed portrayal of Richard III, but again, I have a soft spot for it. Last of the kind of sweeping historical romances is actually not a Richard III romance. I know, I'm breaking with tradition here, but this is a romance with Edward IV, so Richard's older brother. And this is The Innocent by Posie Graeme Evans. This book is an absolute mess, and it's actually a trilogy that I've never carried on with because this first book is such an absolute mess, and it is such a fantasy. It is absolutely out of the realm of possibility, and it also focuses on an original character that is given such an incredible backstory. It's just absolutely unbelievable, and thus it is really a whole lot of fun. In so many ways, historical fiction just needs to be about the Wars of the Roses for me to enjoy it, and that's really how I can rationalize enjoying this book, is that it was set during the Wars of the Roses, because it is absolutely at its heart a genuine historical romance. And things do happen, and of course the Wars of the Roses are ongoing, but this is really more of an OC romance with Edward IV. In many ways, you could term this series and A Rose for the Crown by Anne Easter Smith, you could term these books fan fiction because they are actual original characters. Now, A Rose for the Crown is kind of positing maybe this was a real life woman that she's just given a personality and a backstory for, because we do know that Richard had illegitimate children. Now, Edward IV was a bit of a rake. And he did have many affairs, but I don't believe that she ever was intending to model this on an actual historical figure, somebody who actually came into contact with King Edward, but I just absolutely love it. I think these books are slammed because they are so-called historical fan fiction, but again, that's a little bit of a guilty pleasure for me. This is really, really fun in a way that feels very nostalgic for me. I would say The Innocent is written in kind of the same vein as, 80s and 90s historical fantasy. Historical fiction of that period tended to be very kind of knight-like or quest-like, and really a little bit whitewashed, you might say. The harder aspects of the time period were never really touched on, and that's the way this feels to me. And since I kind of grew up reading that type of book, I really do feel like reading a series like this is very nostalgic for me. This one also will not work for everyone, and of course it is pro-Yorkist, so again, if you don't really like that, I think that you might struggle with this one. But if you were just looking for a good time, I think this series will scratch that itch. Another that I have a real special fondness for is The Seventh Son by Reay Tannahill. So this book focuses pretty primarily on Richard III, but it also does heavily focus on Richard III's real-life best friend, Francis Lovell. And I think that that was really refreshing. Francis Lovell doesn't get a lot of airplay in Wars of the Roses historical fiction, which is really interesting because he was very, very close with Richard throughout his life. I feel like this is a fairly nuanced portrayal of Richard III. He's not wholly good, he's not wholly bad, and that really does make me pretty affectionate towards this book. And it is a standalone, which does make it pretty valuable in the realm of Wars of the Roses historical fiction. In general, I just really like Reay Tannahill's writing, and I wish that more people were talking about her. I wish that more people remembered her books because she really was pretty spectacular. If I had to say, though, I would say that this does skew pro-Yorkist. Drum roll, please. Last but not least, this is my favorite Richard III historical fiction, and this is also just my favorite Wars of the Roses historical fiction. That's The Sunne and Splendour by Sharon K. Penman. Now, Sharon K. Penman is another great of the historical fiction world. This is her behemoth on Richard III. This is such a spectacular novel. It really tells Richard's life from childhood up through adulthood, through his death. It is so mind-blowing. It is so detailed, but it also shows a really positive portrayal of Richard. So much so that Richard essentially does nothing wrong in this book. Everything that we have judged him for historically, there was a reason for. You sympathize with Richard on it, and you know he didn't have any other option. He didn't have any other option but to become king. And while I do really love a rosy portrait of Richard III, it is a bit of my guilty pleasure. I do think this one gives him way too many breaks. There is never a moment of hardship for him. Every decision decision made, it's essentially made for him, and he is on the right side of it. And I know that that will bother a lot of people, and I think it will bother a lot of modern readers more than it would when this book was initially published, though this was really one of the historical fictions that really turned people's opinions about Richard III around. And so it's a very important book from that aspect. It actually is a really important book to the Richard III society, and in terms of just kind of historical perception of Richard. A lot of people's attitudes about Richard actually changed due to reading this book. And I just think this is an absolutely spectacular feat of historical fiction. It's worth reading on its own, even if you're not into the Wars of the Roses, if you're just into historical fiction. If you can only read one book about the Wars of the Roses, this is the one I would recommend you pick up, because I do think it gives you a bird's eye view of events, especially through Richard's eyes. And though it is a really favorable portrayal of Richard, I still think it can be a really wonderful gateway into the time period. Sharon K. Penman's writing is also incredibly beautiful, and in so many ways, I wish that she had written more about this period. I wish she had written other huge, massive books on Warwick Kingmaker, on Edward IV, on George, Duke of Clarence. I wish that we had her writing a book like this for every person in the Wars of the Roses. Certainly she would have had to retread a lot of old ground, but I would have forgiven that. So this is it. This is definitely my favorite Wars of the Roses historical fiction. I would love to know if you have read any of these and what your opinion about them was down below. And if you have any recommendations for Wars of the Roses historical fiction, I would also love to hear about it down below. But that's going to be all for me today. I hope you're all having a great week. Happy reading. Goodbye.